an apple in a grocery store can be over a year old. And this is because all the apples are mainly domestic. And so they're picked around now, right? Like, August, September, October is when you have your apple season, but you can buy an American apple in like June, July. And so the way that happens is that apples are stored. And so what we did was we said, okay, well, if we can tell which storage room is the most ripe, that could be really useful, because right now packers are kind of playing a little bit of a game of behind which door is the most mature fruit, and that's not great when each room is worth between $1 and $5 million. And it can turn into applesauce, which is $0. So what we do is we put those sensors inside those storage rooms, and we monitor their ripening. And the first year that we just trialed, so we weren't getting any paying customers or anything, we're just seeing if it worked. That first year, we helped a customer save like about $600,000 because they were going to hold a room way longer than it should have been held. And that's when, we started seeing that this could be something profitable and useful, which is doubly important.
Hello and welcome to Say Hi to the Future, a podcast aimed at highlighting the human side of ingenuity. My name is Ken Tenser, CEO of SpyderWorks, a leading business consultancy for mid-market organizations and corporate entrepreneurs globally. With me today is Katherine Sizov, CEO and founder of Strella Biotechnology, a company that detects the ripeness of fruit, helping companies avoid potential food waste. Like this video if you enjoy our show and subscribe to our channel. Leave us with a comment on who we should interview next. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy the show. Katherine Sizov, welcome to Say Hi to the Future.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Katherine, we're going to talk about Strella Biotechnology today, but before we jump into that and your company and your journey along with it, you actually studied molecular biology at the University of Pennsylvania. For those of us listening that may not know, what is molecular biology?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the easiest way to put it is studying things that you cannot see. So the really teeny tiny parts of biology, so proteins or neurons or things that are basically the gears of the larger piece, which is usually a biological organism.
And so that relates to humans, because you're working with agriculture and produce. So when you talk about that, does that relate to all proteins in all different areas, or?
That's a good question. I actually started in studying humans and human diseases, specifically neuromuscular ones. But a lot of the kind of basic core fundamental principles remain the same, right? Plants and animals have DNA. That DNA folds into proteins or encodes proteins. And so a lot of the basics of molecular bio can be translated across different organisms, but a lot of the details are obviously pretty different.
So you made quite a leap then from where you started into what Strella is doing today with food waste and looking at produce. How did that happen? How did that whole idea come about?
Yeah, I think it came about from reading that 40% of food is wasted before it's consumed, which is not a statistic that I think belongs in the 21st century whatsoever. I got swiftly, after reading that, I felt very guilty because I didn't know where my food comes from at the grocery store. I just took it for granted that every day I can go in and have access to fresh food 24/7, basically. That led on a challenge of learning about the food supply chain, which is, obviously a very complicated and daunting thing, but that's what makes it interesting to solve.
So you're saying that 40% is wasted before it's consumed. Is that, break it down a bit. So is that during or within the supply chain? Is that ourselves as consumers in our fridges How does that look, or how does that break down a bit?
I think in North America, about 12% of that is us as consumers. And then the rest of it is things that happen within the supply chain. So basically, you can imagine the supply chain as a bunch of people playing hot potato with a perishable product. And there's kind of no real guardian of the produce, making sure that it makes its way all the way across the supply chain in a safe way. And that's kind of the problem. And that's kind of where Strella started and came about. But we also think that the consumer waste is oftentimes largely due to inconsistencies within the supply chain. So, for example, I'll go to the grocery store, I'll buy 5 avocados, and 2 of them go bad before I can unpack my bag. And then
Yeah.
the other 3 of them kind of sit on the shelf for a couple weeks. And that inconsistency is what causes me to throw $3 avocados away. But if I knew that every day that I walked into Whole Foods, for example, that the avocados were going to last me exactly 3 days, I could do a better job planning and reducing my consumer waste as well.
So there's a lot tied up in what you're saying. And if we back it up to the supply chain, one, it almost seems like you're solving a number of problems, especially today. There's such a backup in supply chain in general that it seems like we are shipping things destined for the garbage, landfill, whatever. And that in and of itself seems like a good thing to solve these days, on top of, pure food wastage.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So, one example is kiwis. Kiwis are typically grown in Australia and New Zealand, and it usually takes them about 40 days to get to the United States. But with today's supply chain, it can be upwards of 120 days. And so, like you said, there's an even greater problem, which is, if our existing supply chain had food waste, what do you do in situations like these where you really have to hold the produce for much longer than you were initially anticipating? And I think the answer to that is, let's try to be a little bit smarter about what we're doing, right? Right now, there are very few parameters on perishable products. So there's very little data that can actually be used. And any data that does exist is siloed as the product moves. So for example, a grower knows a ton about, the baby that they've nurtured and cared for and grown. But that information doesn't get translated to Walmart or Costco. And so how can we collect data, one, and two, translate that data across multiple different supply chain players as the product is moving?
So as you're saying that, I'm wondering too, there is what we'll call the supply chain to retail. There is at retail. Is there ultimately an opportunity, as you alluded to before, to say these avocados are going to last for 3 days? Like, is that sort of the end goal there? Is it something that A, can support the consumer, we're in the front of store, but B, help the retailers understand which produce should be put out first?
Exactly. That's exactly what we do with retailers. So basically, let's say you have 2 pallets of avocados. One pallet can, sit in inventory or on the store shelf for many weeks, and the other one can't do that. So obviously, logically, you'd prioritize the one that can't move. Right now, the retailer doesn't have that level of visibility, and so they're treating those 2 pallets of avocados the same way, which is why we have kind of an inconsistent product. But if we did have that knowledge, then we could always prioritize the fruit that was going to go bad faster, get it on the shelf without any consequence to the buyer, because this is all predictive and proactive, and use that really strong fruit as kind of a buffer, if you will, to make sure that we have that flexibility in the supply chain.
So ultimately, I mean, I'm also seeing is because I know that you're growing. I know you've taken Series A, which we'll talk a little bit about. It seems like there's an incredible business model here, if you will. I mean, one, waste along the way is wasted profits for the retailers in the supply chain, and waste along the way is something that we as consumers don't want to keep paying for. So, is this something that will become affordable to implement, or is it already affordable to implement?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're commercialized with a lot of suppliers right now. Our bread and butter is in apples and pears in the United States. And so we basically use our technology to do maturity-based inventory management upstream with huge volumes of apples and pears. And then we're translating that technology into, smaller resolution data to help retailers and importers do the same thing. So work with their inventory in a smarter way.
And sorry, what is smaller resolution data?
Yeah. So, for example, a supplier of apples is moving 5 million apples at once, a huge volume because they've got really big customers, you know, lots of demand for their product. And so, up in supplier levels, what we do is we organize inventory on huge resolutions, like 5 million apples at once. A retailer, when they're thinking about what to send to a grocery store, it's not on the level of 5 million apples, right? And so we have to break it down into a little bit more actionable chunks for retailers and importers.
And how does your technology physically do this? I mean, one of the things that I read, from something you wrote was about fruits talk, we listen. Do fruits talk? How did you figure that out? And what are they telling you?
Yeah, totally. So, fruit produce communicate with each other as they're ripening. So there's some sort of evolutionary advantage to all the fruit on a tree ripening at the same time. I think you want all the fruit to drop to the ground in order to attract deer and other things to eat it. And so the way that fruit do this is they talk to each other using a gas called ethylene. Ethylene is kind of the first indicator of maturity, because the fruit are telling each other, hey, I'm starting to ripen. I think you should too. And that's where you get that effect of one bad apple spoils the bunch. Or if you ever put an unripe banana next to a ripe one, you see that it ripens a lot faster than if it was by itself. And so the idea is, well, why don't we intercept these communications? The fruits are telling us that they're maturing. And the cool thing is, this has been known about for a while. This has been known about since about the 70s. Lots of universities have done studies on ethylene gas as relates to communication. And so we thought, well, you know what? Let's intercept those communications and let's build a sensor that's basically like a piece of fruit, but it's just sitting there and listening to what the other fruit are saying, and then use that to predict how ripe they are.
Very cool. So, it's what the show was say, high being human ingenuity, clever, inventive, original thinking. We talk a lot about passion and savage curiosity. Why do you think that it was you who picked up the ball, if you will, on something that has been around for the 70s? Like what moved you to make that major switch during your undergrad and pursue this company?
I think on the broader scale, I think there's always a little bit of a gap between academia and the field, if you will. And so there are things that are studied and understood, but that aren't translated in a way that people can use them and understand it in their operation and process in a way that isn't difficult or a lot of extra work, or understandable. And so I think that's a very critical piece to doing anything, especially when you're introducing a new technology into an industry. On the personal side, I think I wanted to just see what would happen if I went 100% on something. So that was kind of the reason for finding a problem that I was really passionate about.
And where do you start? I mean, starting a business is always super challenging, but that morning you wake up and you say, this is the business that I want to start, that I want to get into. Tell me about some of the challenges and speaking to people about the concept and how you were able to even push it across the goal line, if you will.
Totally. And I don't think there is one goal line, which is another challenge, is that, it's moving goalposts. And it certainly is hard. Like, one of the challenges I faced was that I didn't have a schedule, right? No one cared when I woke up. No one cared what I was doing with myself that day. And coming out of a structured environment like school, that's a little bit challenging to adapt and adjust to that. And there's a lot of, oh man, I really have to follow my gut here and what I think is right over like just a standard structure. So that's always really challenging. I did leverage university. So I think that people sometimes might misconstrue the idea of a risk. I don't think it's that big of a risk, especially when you're in college, to try something out and, fall flat on your face sometimes, because the whole point is that you're young, you're learning, you're not an expert in anything yet. So there's no expectations. And so I think I leveraged a lot of that kind of freedom and flexibility to try to build something out of university. But in general, I think people take the idea of starting something as like a huge risk, but I don't think it is. I think Bill Burr said something along the lines of, sleeping on someone else's couch when you're 35, pursuing your passion isn't really a risk. A risk is, waking up in a king size bed next to someone you don't like doing something you hate and realizing, what the heck am I doing with my life? And I totally agree with that.
So you talk about your gut and how your gut drove you to make some of the decisions. What did your gut tell you about who you should bring along on this journey?
Yeah, I think it started out as a need basis. So, I've got that molecular bio background and I can start building a sensor, but I can't, for example, get a signal from that sensor to the cloud. I have no idea how to do
Mhm.
that. And so I looked for an engineer who could help me do that. And that was the first person that came on board, Ziyang, who still is with Strella, an incredible person. To call him just an engineer is doing him a disservice. And then after that, I found my co-founder, Jacob. He knew so much about apples and storage and ag, having worked at DuPont previously. And I was like, wow, this is refreshing that, this guy knows so much about my industry, knows my customers. So it's a pretty natural fit to start to work together. And I think that's just how it went is, as you're growing, expanding your capabilities, you realize, wow, I can't do something. And that's when it's time to bring someone new onto the team.
And so you bring this team together, it's fledgling, you come up with, I guess, what would have been your MVP. How do you start to present this to the supply chain, and where do you start?
Yeah, we started super, super upstream, so very close to the grower. We worked with the packer first. So the packer is someone who takes, apples and pears that have been picked, and then they're responsible for storing them. So yeah, an apple in a grocery store can be over a year old. And this is because all the apples are mainly domestic. And so they're picked around now, right? Like, August, September, October is when you have your apple season, but you can buy an American apple in like June, July. And so the way that that happens is that apples are stored. And so what we did was we said, okay, well, if we can tell which storage room is the most ripe, that could be really useful because right now packers are kind of playing a little bit of a game of behind which door is the most mature fruit, and that's not great when each room is worth between $1 and $5 million.
Mhm.
And it can turn into applesauce, which is $0. So what we do is we put those sensors inside those storage rooms, and we monitor their ripening. And the first year that we just trialed, so we weren't getting any paying customers or anything, we're just seeing if it worked. That first year, we helped a customer save like about $600,000 because they were going to hold a room way longer than it should have been held. And that's when, we started seeing that this could be something profitable and useful, which is doubly important.
So when you're talking about the sensors and monitoring the room, you're monitoring the level of ethylene gas, the emittance. I'm not exactly sure. How does that work?
Well, the biggest thing is the rate of change. So if you're a packer, your job is to say, okay, well, when the fruit has been picked off the tree, it's good quality. Typically, you don't want it to get much more mature. You want it to kind of stay the way that it is. And so what we do is we say, okay, we want to keep the fruit the same way. And so what we look at mostly is the rate of change of ethylene emission. So the fruit is in that room and it's, kind of hibernating. And then at some point it wakes up and starts maturing. And that's why you kind of want to tell the packer, hey, this fruit has woken up. You've got a couple of months until it starts changing in quality. So let's start sending that down the supply chain.
And how does it work between different types of produce? I mean, I got to be honest, I did not know that I was eating year-old apples until about 2 minutes ago. How does that work between different types of produce? I mean, because I'm guessing that the kiwi versus the apple versus the avocado ripen at different paces naturally.
Yeah, they do. And they have different kind of decision points. So, for example, pears, they get softer earlier in their maturity phase. And that's a problem when you're putting it into boxes and things like that because they can bump and bruise. And so, while every piece of fruit emits, not every piece of fruit, but 30% of the food waste is generated by 10 commodities, all of which emit ethylene. And those pieces of fruit all emit ethylene, but the way that they do it is a little bit different. And so basically the technology is the same, but the models and the way that we use to interpret the data that we collect is different.
And what was even more stunning to me is that the emissions that you're measuring, or the carbon emissions of food waste, are greater than all transportation combined. and as you say, we think about cars being the huge problem, or the number one, it's actually food waste. How does that come about? That's an incredible sort of eye opener to me.
Yeah, it's terrible. It's just stuff rotting in the landfill, which is generating carbon emissions, and that's really upsetting because cars, at least there's some sort of usefulness to them, but food waste, it's just going bad and it's wasting natural resources, and so there's absolutely no winning when you're talking about food waste. I recently heard a statistic that leaf blowers are actually way worse than cars because they don't have a catalytic converter. Running a leaf blower for 10 minutes is the equivalent in carbon emissions as driving a car from Seattle to San Diego, I believe, which is crazy. So apparently leaf blowers are the real problem here.
I did not know that either. So what we're talking about too, when I look at Strella, we've done a lot of discussions with people in ag tech in general, and agricultural technology just seems to be one of the most important areas. Are you, as Strella grows, are you more and more involved in that overall ag tech discussion of, obviously there are more people, there's less land, there are fewer people who want to work the land, if you will. So are you more and more involved in that type of level of discussion?
Yeah, I think with ag, there's a lot of different facets. There's the innovation piece of it. So what can we do to solve problems like labor shortages, like increased production, like these delayed supply chain issues. There's the legislative piece of it, which is, how do we incentivize people to do the right thing? Or how can we, what kind of change can we enact from the government side of things? And then there's the corporate side, which is how can we make, companies do a better job when it comes to being sustainable and resourceful when they're discussing ideas of agriculture. So I think I've been part of a lot of really interesting discussions to see how all these things can tie together and ultimately work together. But I think there's still, again, it's a huge problem. Food waste is such a big, complicated problem, and it requires so many different folks. I think we still got a long way to go.
Well, no, I agree with you there, but I am glad to hear that you're becoming part of the conversation, and I've heard it on so many different levels of technology in certain areas to run equipment, how it's not available, how connectivity is not available. So many things that I think that combined with what companies like Strella are doing that can change the complexion of agriculture completely and waste. So it's wonderful to hear that the next generation is so fully committed.
Yeah, I think a lot of folks want, especially in my generation, want to do something that's that makes a change in a positive way for their environment and the people around them. And I think agriculture can absolutely provide that type of feeling good about what you do. It's in the real world, and it's about feeding people, which is kind of one of the primary things we do. So
Right.
super important.
That's an important point too, because having a passion for what we're doing and building a company that actually creates greater value for humanity. I think frankly, I look back and I've started and exited a number. I mean, that really is the key differentiator. When you can find something you're passionate about that actually provides that greater level of give back, I think you're in a wonderful place.
1,000%. I think obviously starting something like a startup or any venture or any personal endeavor is very challenging. And so there's always some sort of truth that you have to stick to at the end of the day to get yourself through those tough situations. And I think for people, our team, it's hopefully everything that we're doing here is something good, something that can be helping others. And that's what keeps us going.
So how far down the road do you look with Strella? Do you look a year down, 3 years? Like where do you see this, evolving to?
That's a good question. Well, right now we're working in other commodities. So we started in apples and pears, and we're expanding into bananas and flowers and kiwis. So we're working on that as well as other supply chain segments. So yeah, we started really, really close to the grower, doing huge volumes of stuff. And now we're looking into working with retailers and working with importers and connecting that supply chain with all this information that we've collected. Ultimately, I think what we're trying to do is to build a system of record, basically have that ultimate transparency and visibility into what a piece of produce is doing from the moment it was picked all the way that it reached the consumer's hands. And that presents a lot of interesting future opportunities as well.
Dare I bring up something like blockchain? I mean, is there a way that we're going to measure or follow every single piece?
I think in the current environment, we're not allowed to bring blockchain, but yeah, absolutely. Right. Like, that's a tool for, keeping data in a secure way that multiple users can access. And so there definitely is a natural fit for blockchain. I think there are other things to figure out on that side. For now, we'll be the ones generating the data.
Got it. Got it. Sounds good. So Katherine Sizov, Strella Biotechnology. Our time's coming close to the end here, but I have one last question, if you will. Look, you've been incredibly successful. When I look at you, you've just come out of a Series A raise with some very, very well-known folks in the industry. You've gotten incredible, as you say, continued support from your seed round investors who are very well known. How do you attract that level of investor? What is your pitch when you say, here is Strella, here's the idea? How did you engage with them?
Yeah, that's a good question. One I'm trying to figure out myself too, right? I think ultimately it comes down to picking something that you're so passionate about that you can say the same thing over and over 100,000 times, and it still comes across as convincing and interesting, and that you're motivated and driven by it. And so I think that's what a lot of investment is or pitching to investors is understanding what the core fundamentals of your business are, how you're going to make money, obviously, and how you're going to get there, but also convincing people that you are the one that's going to do it.
Thank you very much. Passion, savage curiosity, audacity. We talk a lot about just having the gumption to go out and do it, which you obviously did. So thank you so much for sharing some of your time today. Best of luck. And thanks again for being on Say Hi to the Future.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity.